If you want to ace your ANP2 final exam, you are in the right place. In this video, we're going to go through 100 multiple choice questions about things that you are going to need to know for your final exam. And I'm an ANP instructor myself, and I know I've given these questions to my students, so I know what your professors are going to give to you. Hey everybody, Organized Biology here, where we make difficult biology concepts simple. And before we get started, I want to let you know about a really exciting opportunity. We've been building something with the Vuvo team, a learning app that's going to help you learn and retain ANP. Now, if you're watching this before the launch, you can actually get a 10% discount off of it. Click the link in the description below. If you're watching after the launch, sometime in February or March of 2026, you can get immediate access to that app. So go ahead and click that link in the description below. And secondly, if you want access to this final exam specifically, there's a link right below it. It's going to give you access to all the questions and answers so you can quiz yourself. So let's get right into it. Number one, the most abundant formed element in blood is A, leukocytes, B, platelets, C, plasma proteins, or D, erythrocytes. So we're looking at formed elements. Now, if we were to take your whole blood and spin it down, we would actually see kind of three distinct layers. The very bottom, about 45% here, would be this deep red. Then we'd see a very, very thin light coat called the buffy coat. That's less than 1% of your whole blood. And then on the very top, we would actually see plasma, the liquid form of your blood, and that's give or take 55%. So again, that's plasma. That's like the water, the electrolytes, the proteins, etc. Whereas down here, this is actually going to be our cells, aka our formed elements. And as you can see here, obviously a lot of it is red. So therefore, we're going to say for this answer, it is the red cell. That is D, erythro, meaning red, cyte cells. It's your red blood cells. Leukocytes would be the white blood cells. It's a very small percentage, and platelets would be in there as well. And then plasma proteins would be just a very small percentage of the whole plasma. So the correct answer would be D. All right, next up, number two, the hormone that stimulates RBC production is A, renin, B, erythropoietin, C, aldosterone, or D, prolactin. So first off, you need to know what RBC stands for. Anytime you see RBC, we know it means red blood cells. And as we talked about, red blood cells, another name for these is erythrocytes. Yes? So if you look at obviously the answers, we've got erythropoietin, literally translating to a protein that deals with producing red blood cells. Okay? So the correct answer would be B. A, renin, that is actually the kidney protein released during low filtration pressure at the kidney. C, aldosterone, that's going to be basically a hormone that tells us to reabsorb salt into our bloodstream to boost up our blood volume. And then D would be prolactin, that's a hormone, and that's going to stimulate milk production in the mammary glands for females. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the red blood cells. Now here's a good one. Hemoglobin binds oxygen primarily to its A, heme group. I notice it says C. I'm going to say that's B, globin chains, that's on me. C, plasma membrane, or D, granules. So with hemoglobin, that is the red blood cell protein. So 98% of your red blood cells are packed full of this hemoglobin protein. And we say that this is a tetrameric protein because it's got 4 individual subunits that kind of cement together, I believe it's through disulfide bonds, and create this 4-protein hemoglobin, okay? Now, at the center of each of these is a very, very important atom, and that's going to be the atom of iron. So these are all considered your heme groups because they are iron containing, which is Fe. And what we know about Fe, iron, is it loves to grab onto oxygen. So we know in this case, the heme group will bind the oxygen. Now additionally though, the globin chain, so the amino acid part of the hemoglobin, can also bind to hydrogen ions, interestingly enough, change the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen as well as CO2. So we might see that a little more later on in the respiratory system. So the correct answer would be A. All right, I love me some blood typing questions. A person with AB positive blood can receive blood from A, O only, B, A and B only, C, AB only, or D, any blood type. So if you know this, AB positive blood, if we were to look at that blood cell, it would have 3 antigens or flags on it. It would obviously be that A antigen, it would have a B antigen, and then it would have a Rho positive antigen. So that means that we've got 3 different flags that this person's red blood cells identifies with in a way. And what we know is that you cannot receive a new antigen. That's like the whole goal of blood transfusions. You can't receive a new antigen. So if we know that these are basically the only main three flags, there are others. If we have a blood cell coming into this person that's just type A, well, if he's getting that, is that fine? Absolutely, because there's no new antigen being presented. What if it's type B? Well, in this case, again, we already know that flag, so we can certainly do that. What if it's just a O positive blood type? So it's got the positive antigen and nothing else? Well, hey, we've got that flag as well. So actually any blood type, A, B, AB, or O, can all be transfused to an AB positive person. They're considered the universal donor. So the correct answer would be D, any blood type. All right, number 5. The first step in hemostasis is A, coagulation, B, platelet plug formation, C, vascular spasm, or D, fibrinolysis. So with hemostasis, anytime you hear that word, hemo usually refers to blood. So like hemoglobin, right? It just refers to blood. And then stasis means to stand still. So hemostasis literally translates to blood clotting because it's blood standing still. So when a blood vessel gets severed, so say there's some sort of injury to the blood vessel because maybe you accidentally got cut, you got bruised internally, what have you, you've got blood vessels that just got damaged. Well, when those blood vessels get damaged, we don't want all that blood to just spew out immediately. We don't want to lose blood. So the first step that these blood vessels actually do is they actually spasm out, where it's almost like a deflated balloon where the blood vessel does this type of thing, right? So if you ever let go of a fully balloon, like a fully filled up balloon, it basically deflates. That's essentially what these blood vessels do. They deflate immediately in order to minimize the blood loss. From there, they're going to form that platelet plug. So the platelets in that buffy coat are going to plug this up. We're going to secure it with a fibrin net through a variety of clotting factors, and then we're actually going to coagulate some of the blood that has been lost on top of it. So those would actually be the sequences of events, but the first one, therefore, would be the vascular spasm, which would be answer C. Very good. Moving on to number 6, which white blood cell, WBC, is most important? We've got A, neutrophils, B, basophils, C, eosinophils, or D, lymphocytes. If you've ever heard of this mnemonic, it's very helpful. It's never let monkeys eat bananas. These are the 5 white blood cells in their relative importance. In other words, basically how common they are in your bloodstream. So the first one in would be neutrophils. Then we got lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. But neutrophils take up about 60 to 70% of your whole white blood cell. So therefore, they would be the most common white blood cell, which would be A, neutrophil. Very good. Moving on to number 7. Which of these white blood cells increases during a parasitic infection? This is kind of you know it or you don't. What you need to remember is that eosinophils, kind of spelled weird, E-O-U eosinophils, I think that's how you spell it. I'm probably doing that wrong. I don't think there's an I there. Just like that. Wonderful. These guys are going to be very active during any sort of allergic reaction, as well as anytime you have a parasite. So that's the white blood cell that will get boosted up if you have one of these two things. So you would notice, hey, maybe these eosinophils, in terms of their percentage, hops above the monocytes if you are currently having an allergic reaction or a parasite. So that's something you could actually tell. If you're a doctor, you draw blood from a person and you see that count as high, we can assume these guys, if they're high, we've got an allergic reaction or a parasite. So pretty interesting. All right, number 8. Which substance is required for clotting? Is it vitamin C, vitamin A, sodium, or vitamin K? What I always remember is that we've got certain vitamins that are insoluble, and I always remember it's DECA. So these are your fat-soluble vitamins. And then we've got the water-soluble vitamins B and C. Now notice when you say vitamin C, you use kind of the S, the soft C, right? Whereas when you use the K, you make that K sound, right? So I always remember K stands for clotting. Vitamin K is very important for blood clotting. In fact, so much so that newborns, when they are first born, they typically have a very low amount of vitamin K. So the doctors will actually give them a vitamin K shot to help them in case they got some blood vessels damaged during the labor and the birth of that baby. So very interesting clinical connection. So the correct answer would be D, vitamin K. All right, moving on. Number 9, iron is stored in the liver primarily as A, ferritin, B, hemoglobin, C, biliverdin, or D, globulin. This is a great question. So let's look at hemoglobin first. B, hemoglobin, didn't I say that that has iron? It absolutely does. But that's not the question. The question is the liver. How does the liver store it? So it's not hemoglobin because there's not like just blood cells making up the liver itself. Now, biliverdin is actually a byproduct of red blood cell breakdown, okay? So that's why sometimes biliverdin turns green whenever you have a bruise. It's basically the red blood cells being broken down, and that's not in your liver either. So it's not that one. And then globulin is just a classic term for a carrier protein. And again, that's in the bloodstream. So it's not necessarily in your liver. So therefore, the correct answer would be ferritin. That would be A. Now, what's interesting about ferritin is that that is a better marker in a way for iron deficiency. So let's say a person's got normal iron levels, but their ferritin is low. It might be an indicator that, hey, maybe the body doesn't have enough stored iron to continually making red blood cells. So that could be an issue that you run into, but you do have to ask for that on a test if you're asking for it from a doctor. So ask for your ferritin count if you're kind of tired, feeling anemic, but your iron levels are normal. So that is how the iron primarily is stored in the liver. A, ferritin. Great. Moving on to 10, we already answered this, which is great. So we're already 10 questions in. The buffy coat contains what? We've got erythrocytes, A, plasma proteins, B, leukocytes and platelets, C, or D, clotting factor. So I said this is the little buffy coat. You don't have much of it in your whole blood, right? But inside of that is going to be your white blood cells as well as your platelets. So the correct answer would be C, leukocyte, which translates to white cell, as well as your platelets. We're going to move on. All right, so we're going to move out of blood a little bit, and we're going to go into the endocrine system where we're talking about hormones and all the things that they do. So number 11 is which gland controls the pituitary gland? A, the adrenal cortex, B, the pancreas, C, the hypothalamus, or D, the parathyroid gland. Hopefully you know this answer if you've taken an A&P2 course at this point, but we know that the pituitary is the master regulator gland of your body. So it kind of looks like this. We've got an anterior section and a posterior section, but the most important thing is that right above it is a very important nerve structure that contains a lot of neurons that will influence the actions of the pituitary gland. So we might be making some releasing hormones into the anterior, we might be directly communicating hormones into the posterior, but this structure up here made of neurons is called the hypothalamus. So what I tell my students is that hypothalamus, H, deals with homeostasis, and since the pituitary gland releases about 12, 13 hormones or so, actually that's a little much, it's going to be the master regulator gland of your body. So which one controls it? C, the hypothalamus. Very good. Now, number 12, it says the posterior pituitary releases what? We've got A, ACTH and TSH, B, GH and LH, C, FSH and prolactin, or D, ADH and oxytocin. Okay, so this is kind of a know it or you don't. Just know that on the posterior pituitary, we're only going to have two hormones. And I always remember the posterior pituitary is going to be at a certain point of view, POV. Maybe you've heard of this before, right? So the posterior pituitary releases two things starting with O and V. The first one is going to be oxytocin. Okay, so that's one of the answers. So we can see it's either what? Oh, it's D. Well, we know that now. But what's the V? That doesn't look right. We have ADH and oxytocin for D. Well, vasopressin is another name for ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So you may have heard of this. You may have heard of vasopressin. It's the same thing. So posterior pituitary releases these two. That would be correct answer D. All right. Number 13, the primary effect of aldosterone is to A, lower blood pressure, B, increase sodium reabsorption, C, increase heart rate, or D, lower blood glucose. Once again, these are kind of you know it or you don't, but if you look at the word aldosterone, I always tell my students that aldosterone kind of has the following thing in it, S-A-L-T. I always remember it's aldoster salt, because aldosterone helps us reabsorb specifically sodium, but always chlorine comes along with the ride. So therefore, reabsorbing this will boost up our blood volume. So the correct answer would be B, increase sodium reabsorption. All right, moving on. Number 14, which hormone lowers blood glucose? So we've got A, insulin, B, glucagon, C, cortisol, or D, epinephrine? Now, the hormones that control blood glucose are in the pancreas, and the pancreas has two options. It can release either insulin, so here's the pancreas, it can release either insulin or it can release glucagon. These are the two hormones of the pancreas. Now, insulin is going to lower glucose levels in the blood, whereas glucagon is actually going to raise glucose levels in the blood. Now, this is where it can get tricky. So the correct answer obviously is A, insulin, because it lowers blood sugar. But the triggers for these hormones are the opposite. Think about it. If insulin lowers blood glucose, what was the issue in the first place? Well, high blood glucose, right? We had too high, which is a bad thing. Insulin was released, it lowers it, right? Whereas what about glucagon? What would be the trigger for glucagon? Well, obviously it would be low glucose. It was too low, so now we have to raise it back up. This is all about negative feedback loops when it comes to homeostasis. Something's too low, the response brings it back up. Something's too high, the response brings it back down. This is all A&P1 stuff, y'all. So if you haven't watched that, you can go ahead and watch my A&P1 final review as well on this channel. But let's move on for the time being for A&P2. Number 15, T3 and T4 require which element? So these are your thyroid hormones. And we know that from the past, interestingly, people used to get some diseases of their thyroid like a goiter because they weren't getting a certain dietary supplement. So which one is it? Let's look. We've got A, iron, B, iodine, C, calcium, and D, phosphorus. Again, this is kind of you know it or you don't. Iron deals with red blood cell production, but iodine, that is actually imperative because in these names is triiodothreonine is one of these thyroid hormones. Triiodothreonine. That means we have some iodine inside of it to produce these hormones. Now, if you look at your like Morton's salt cylinder, whatever you want to call it, it's actually going to be iodized salt. The reason for that is because the majority of Americans way back when weren't getting enough iodine in their diet, so they were getting all these thyroid disorders, so therefore we just added it to common products to boost our iodine levels to allow us to make T3 and T4. Really interesting story there. All right, number 16, which hormone is involved in circadian rhythms? So circadian kind of refers to the circle of the day, 24 hours, right? So we've got A, melatonin, B, cortisol, C, TH, assuming thyroid hormone there, and then D, calcitonin. Now, what's interesting about this one is B, cortisol, actually could be right because you typically, when you wake up, you actually have an elevated cortisol level and then it kind of drops throughout the day typically. But the one that allows you to have these sleep-wake cycles in the right patterns is always going to be A, melatonin. Okay, so melatonin, it helps to kind of induce sleep, but it's also as it releases itself, it kind of guides you through different cycles of sleep, and then it drops down when you need to wake up. Okay, it's actually a product of the pineal gland, interestingly. So number 16 is A. Number 17, parathyroid hormone directly increases which? A, insulin, B, bone deposition, C, blood calcium, or D, serum vitamin D. So we know parathyroid hormone is actually released by the parathyroid glands. So if we look at the thyroid gland, this is wrapped around your neck. It's about right here. And on the back side, we've got these little nodules called the parathyroid glands, okay? And they are specifically going to detect low blood calcium. So when they detect that, the parathyroid hormone will be released. So I want you to guess what is going to be the effect of parathyroid hormone. Well, hopefully the goal is to then raise blood calcium. And they do that by stimulating osteoclasts, breaks down the bone, releases that calcium into the blood. It also talks to the small intestine, the kidneys to help it absorb and reabsorb some more calcium. So what's interesting about this one, obviously the answer is C then, blood calcium, but D could be potentially correct because typically vitamin D and calcium are kind of go hand in hand. So vitamin D helps you build bones, helps you absorb the calcium. So you could maybe argue that a parathyroid hormone does help increase vitamin D in your blood, but it's not a direct cause. Pretty interesting. All right, let's keep moving forward. Number 18. Stress, I love this one. Stress stimulates the adrenal medulla to release what? We've got A, cortisol, B, aldosterone, C, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and D, ADH. We know with the adrenal glands, we've got two main parts to it. We've got kind of the middle part, and then we've got the outer part. So the outer part is called the cortex. The middle part is called the medulla. Okay, that's the adrenal gland. It sits on top of the kidneys. I always call the adrenal glands the kidney hats. It's kind of funny. Now, what we know is that the cortex produces something called cortisol, right? And you know that as the stress hormone, right? It raises your blood sugar levels, stimulates fight or flight potentially. But that's not the question. The question was, what does the medulla make in response to stress? We know that sympathetic neurons can come and talk to the medulla, and the medulla will produce our friends, epinephrine and norepinephrine, although the most physiologically impactful one will be that epinephrine. So the correct answer would be C, epi and norepi. Very good question there. Number 19, hormones that act on nearby cells via the interstitial fluid are A, endocrine, B, paracrine, C, autocrine, or D, neurotransmitters. So we really need to know our words here. Anytime we're talking about endocrine system, we're talking about internal crying or secretion. This is when we're dumping hormones specifically into the bloodstream, right? So the hormones are in the blood. They can go virtually everywhere to virtually every cell of the body to make their effect if they have a receptor for that hormone. But in this case, we're saying like, hey, we've got some cells here that are kind of nearby to each other, and maybe one is producing a certain hormone that might only affect the nearby cells. Well, if you're thinking about the word nearby or next to, we know that nearby refers to para, like a para-educator is next to another educator. So if you look at the answers, what do we have? Paracrine. Paracrine means nearby secretion, okay? So that would be the correct answer, B for paracrine. All right, moving on, still with the hormones. Number 20, hyper, too much, secretion of GH. What is GH? It's growth hormone in adults. So we've got too much growth hormone in an adult, and it results in what? A, dwarfism, B, gigantism, C, cretinism, or D, acromegaly. So with growth hormone, you can imagine it's going to help you grow. But this is a person who is an adult. Important because adults, if you look at their bones, specifically their long bones will no longer contain that cartilage epiphyseal plate. So that means the adults, they don't have this, so they can no longer, man, if I can erase that with my finger, there we go. They can't grow their bones lengthwise, okay? And growth hormone's a big impactor of that. Growth hormone tells your bones basically grow lengthwise, especially as you're going through adolescence, right? But growth hormone, too much of it in adulthood is still going to stimulate these bones to grow. But how are they going to grow? They're not going to grow lengthwise. They're actually going to grow widthwise. So they will get very thick. So you will therefore be very thick-limbed or big-limbed. They will be very dense. What's that term called? Limb or joint acromegaly. Big, right? So you've got big limbs, all right? So the correct answer would be D. Now, if you had hypersecretion of growth hormone when you're a child, that would actually result in gigantism. Your epiphyseal plate would never close. You would just keep getting taller and taller and taller, okay? Now, I know what you're thinking. Where can I get such a cool shirt like this? Well, if you scroll down, I do have a shop where you can buy shirts and coffee mugs and bags for organized biology. I really appreciate the support. And also, if you would like the video, subscribe to the channel if it's been helpful. Make a comment saying, hey, thank you, Mr. J. Really appreciate it. Again, check out the description for all of these exciting opportunities to help you prepare either for your final or just to retain everything you're learning in ANP with that great offer from Vuvo. I'm really excited about that. I think that'll be a tremendous resource for you guys. So let's move on into 21. The pacemaker of the heart is the what? A, AV node, B, the Purkinje fibers, C, the bundle of His, or D, the SA node. So hopefully you know this if you've learned about the heart, but the correct answer is going to be that first tissue that is going to stimulate the heartbeat before going to another tissue that will then talk to the ventricles of the heart to stimulate there. So if I were to outline this whole thing, the heart would be kind of organized in this fashion. Okay, that was a terrible drawing. But the heart is going to be started by the topmost node, and that is going to be that SA node. Now, once the SA node fires, just to roll through it, it's going to talk to the atria, get those to contract. and it's going to talk to that AV node here. That AV node is going to fire down that bundle of his right here. So that's the bundle of his. Even if you're a her, you have a bundle of his. Always a good joke. And then it's going to go down through the bundle branches. The first one's bundle branches. And then once we get down in through the ventricles, these are going to be that Purkinje fibers. So that is the order of the conduction system of the heart, basically telling the heart to contract atria first, atria first, then ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles. So we have a very efficient heartbeat. Well done. All right, number 22. This always gets my students. Which of the following vessel carries oxygen-rich blood? A, pulmonary vein, B, pulmonary artery, C, inferior vena cava, or D, the hepatic vein. Now, normally what people say are like, oh, A is artery. Arteries are always oxygenated. Well, let's be careful here. Let's roll through them real quick, and I'm actually going to start with D. D, hepatic vein. Hep always refers to the liver. So it's a vein coming back from the liver, which is a part of our body. So anytime we're coming from a body tissue, it's always going to be low in oxygen because we just dropped it off to those tissues. Then we look at the inferior vena cava. Well, the vena cava is literally translated to the vein cave of your heart, and it's a really big vein draining blood up. Now here, I can draw it right here, draining blood back up into the right atrium or down into the right atrium from the top part of the body. But same case in point, it's coming from the body, so it's going to be very low in oxygen. So the question is pulmonary. Well, we know that pulmonary always refers to the what? The lungs, obviously. Now, when we go to the lungs, well, why are we going to the lungs? Because we need oxygen, right? So any blood vessel that's going to be going to the lungs needs oxygen. In other words, it's low in oxygen. So which of these would be low in oxygen? It would be the pulmonary artery would be low in oxygen because we basically just delivered all of the oxygen to the tissues. We got back to the right atrium, goes to the right ventricle. Now it's going out to the pulmonary artery. We're still low in oxygen. But where do we get the oxygen? At the lungs. So we go to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. We pick up the oxygen. So therefore, when we come back through this blood vessel that's actually going to come into the left atria, this is going to be the pulmonary vein. And the pulmonary vein just went to the lungs. It's coming back. So therefore, we have very high oxygen in the pulmonary vein. So the correct answer would be A, pulmonary vein. No matter how many times I teach that, my students still get it wrong. So you're not going to be one of those this time. All right, number 23. The lub sound, which is S1, is due to the closure of what? We've got A, the semilunar valves, we've got B, the atrioventricular valves, we've got C, the mitral valve only, or D, the aortic valve only. So here we're talking about the heart sounds, and the first thing you need to know is the heart sounds are produced by the valves, okay? So imagine a valve is a door. When does the door make the most noise? When you shut it, right? So when the door shuts, boom, you hear that sound. So the question is, which valves are making the sounds in the heart in the first sound as well as in the second sound? So I always draw this kind of simple diagram. So we've got basically two little branches here of the heart, and we're going to represent these guys here, and then we've got one here, okay? What is this going to represent? Well, we're going to have a couple valves here, and this is going to represent the atria, so right and left atria, and then we're also going to have our pulmonary arteries and our aorta, and that's going to be represented here. Those are the two main locations of the valves between the atria and the ventricles here, as well as these valves here. And these guys are going to be the semilunar valves, both in the aorta as well as the pulmonary artery, okay? So what are these valves called if they're between the atria and the ventricle? These are called the AV valves. The two AV valves are your mitral valve and your tricuspid valve. Okay, so during a heartbeat, what did I just tell you about the heartbeat? Well, the atria contract first and then the ventricles contract, okay? So what will happen? Well, the blood is going to go through here first from atria to ventricles. And then, secondly, the blood is going to go up and out through the semilunar valves. So when we are going through the semilunar valves, when they're opening, what do we want these valves to do? We want the AV valves to close first. Why? Because when they close, these guys will open, allowing the blood to get basically from the ventricles and funnel through these semilunar valves. Okay? So that's why the AV valves are going to be that first heart sound. And then as soon as the blood leaves those semilunar valves, well, now this guy will shut. So therefore, this would be the second heart sound when the semilunar valves shut. So therefore, where are my papers? There they are. Which would be the correct answer for this? The lub sound, the first heart sound, was the atrioventricular valves, the AV valve. So B would be the correct answer. It wouldn't be mitral valve only because both tricuspid and mitral would be it. The aortic valve, that's one of the semilunar valves. That'd be a second heart sound. And then semilunar valves, obviously, second heart sound as well. So the correct answer would be B. Well done. All right, number 24, we've got stroke volume times heart rate is what? Well, let's think about it. Well, a stroke volume, SV for short, is basically if you have one stroke, one contraction of the heart's ventricles, how much blood is leaving it. So typically that's about 70 milliliters every heartbeat. So when the heart beats, the ventricles contract, how much blood leaves? About 70 milliliters. And then we've got our heart rate, HR. We'll just say the average for a person is going to be 70 beats per minute. Okay? So if we multiply those things together, we will get somewhere around 4,900. 4,900 milliliters every minute. Well, that is a rate of output for the heart. All right, we're saying how much the heart is basically outputting every minute. Well, look at the names. We've got cardiac output in there. So the correct answer is B, cardiac output. Mean arterial pressure, we're kind of going to get to here in a second. C is pulse pressure, very different. It's dealing with the pressure of the actual pulse that you feel. And then we've got end diastolic volume, which means end of resting, how much of the blood is in the heart. So that doesn't have anything to do with stroke volume and heart rate. So the correct answer would be B. Well done. All right, 25, we're a quarter of the way through. You guys are kicking it. You're doing very well. Kicking it was a good thing. All right, number 25, which layer of an artery contains the smooth muscle? So we've got the tunica media, tunica intima, tunica externa, and then the endothelium, okay? So anytime you look at these words, you can kind of assume what part they are. So let's just kind of draw an artery here, cross section. So we're gonna have a thick layer here. Then we're going to have another layer on the outermost part. We'll talk about what all of these are. Then we've got the tunica intima. I'll draw here in a second. And then we'll have the endothelial layer. So if you just think about it, there's multiple layers to an artery. And anytime you think of the most external part, that's going to be the externa, the tunica externa, if I can spell. Externa, there we go. But then what you'll notice is anytime we're talking about the middle layer of anything, whether it's the intestinal muscle, whether it's the heart layers, usually the middle is made of a bunch of what? Muscle. So the muscle will primarily be in the tunica media of the arteries because for most structures, myo, media, all is going to have the muscle tissue. So the correct answer in this case would be A. All right, number 27. Cruising. Wait, did I skip one? Yeah, I did. Whoops, my bad. Number 26. This is like just, it almost seems like I'm live right now, doesn't it? But hopefully I'm giving you a little bit of a laugh. We need that during final exams. Number 26, blood pressure is highest in the what? You should probably know this. A, venules, B, veins, C, capillaries, or D, arteries. Well, I was talking about when the heart beats, it immediately goes out through arteries. So imagine all of this blood is funneling into a small little blood vessel. There's gonna be a lot of pressure on that vessel as it leaves. So the greatest pressure is going to be in the D, arteries. Secondly, interestingly, it'll be the capillaries. And then lastly would be kind of the veins and venules. Number 27, we've got baroreceptors are located in the A, alveoli, B, aortic arch, C, the liver, or D, the brain. So when we look at that word baroreceptor, okay, I'll write it here. Baro refers to pressure. So baroreceptors are detecting some aspect of pressure. Now you would think like, hey, well, alveoli, that's in the lungs. Don't the lungs kind of detect some pressure? Yeah, kind of. The aortic arch, obviously that's got a lot of pressure on it. See, liver, maybe not. And then the brain, we actually have certain shunts in our brains that's going to change during different pressures. So maybe there's some reasoning there. But with the baroreceptors we're talking about, It's specifically going to be in that main artery coming off of the heart, which is going to be that aorta. And there will be baroreceptors kind of detecting the pressure inside of the aorta. So why do we do that? Well, those baroreceptors can feed back to the brainstem. All right, brainstem. And the brainstem can decide, hey, if this blood pressure is way, way, way too low, well, what could we do? Maybe we could trigger the sympathetic nervous system to trigger the adrenal medulla to make epinephrine to raise blood pressure back up because we don't want to have too low of blood pressure, okay? So it's very important that we're constantly kind of having a pulse, per se, on what your blood pressure is so that we can, if it's too low, raise it, and if it's too high, we can try to lower it, but the body's not very good at lowering blood pressure, which is why a lot of the times we need medications for it. All right, so that's number 27 was B, aortic arch. Number 28, venous return. So basically veins bringing blood back to the heart is aided by what? We've got A, elastic recoil, B, venous dilation, C, skeletal muscle contractions, or D, low thoracic pressure. A, elastic recoil kind of sounds nice, right? Like, oh, it's kind of elastic and it's like recoiling back to press blood back. Well, the elastic recoil is primarily in our arteries because they need to be able to stretch and basically snap back immediately after the blood leaves it. So that's not going to be veins. B, venous dilation. Well, anytime we dilate blood vessels, so say we go from like this and then we go to this, what actually happens is there's a massive decrease in pressure. And if there's a decrease in pressure, well, now things aren't moving very well through it. It's actually going to be moving slower. So that would actually slow down venous return. Whereas C, skeletal muscle contractions, there's an idea because your veins, if you look at where they are, they're kind of lining right next to your muscles. And as you contract your muscles, what you do is you actually push force onto the veins. And since the veins have these little valves, anytime you compress the vein, the blood basically shoots through the vein a lot faster. So that is actually the correct answer. C, skeletal muscle contractions increases the amount of blood pushing back through the veins so we can get back to the heart, so we can push it back out to the body to keep nourishing ourselves during exercise. So the correct answer would be C. All right, number 29, still in the heart. The coronary arteries branch from the what? A, pulmonary trunk, B, aortic arch, C, ascending aorta, or D, the right atrium. That's kind of an interesting one. So we've got two answers that are the aorta, right? Which makes sense because the coronary arteries are the arteries that are actually going to come and feed the heart tissue itself. Okay, so imagine there are some arteries all coming through the heart itself to feed the heart. Very important because if they get blocked, you can have a heart attack. So the question is, where are they coming from? Where are they branching off from? Well, you notice how I drew the origination of both of them, and they're kind of lower down, right? That's because it's at the ascending aorta that these guys will be getting, I drew that print properly, there we go. The ascending aorta, that's where they're going to start branching off, okay? The aortic arch is a little too high. They're not going to branch off there. It's going to be branching off when it's ascending, okay? So the correct answer there would be C, ascending aorta. One fun fact about the coronary arteries is when the heart contracts, the arteries here actually close up. And then when the heart relaxes, they actually open back up. So really, a person with a lower heart rate is feeding the heart tissue itself more, which is why typically a healthier person has a lower heart rate, and the lower heart rate causes their heart to be relatively healthy because it's feeding itself constantly. So fun fact there. All right, almost done with the cardiovascular system. Number 30, the QRS complex does not represent the alphabet in this case, but what does it represent? A, atrial depolarization, B, atrial repolarization, C, ventricular depolarization, or D, ventricular repolarization. So let's real quickly draw your friend, the ECG. Couldn't think of the name for a second. All right, so here's your ECG. We've got a little wave first, and we've got a dip. We go up, we go down, and we got another wave after the fact, okay? So for some reason, we decided to start with the letter P on this graph. Don't ask me why, I don't know the answer, but if somebody could tell me in the comments, I would love it. So we got the P, we got the Q, we got the R, we got the S, and we've got the T waves. Okay, so the question is, what does the QRS complex represent? This guy, right? Well, let's just roll through them. Well, the P wave is always going to be, I just repeated myself, atrial depolarization, where the atria are getting positive to contract. That's the first thing. The second thing that's going to happen is the ventricles need to contract next, right? So this QRS is going to be ventricular depolarization, and that is the correct answer. I think it was C, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it'd be C. But what I want to point out to you is during this same time, we don't see it on the graph, we also have atrial repolarization, where the atria are getting negative again. We just don't see it, but it is occurring here. And then lastly, the T wave, that's when the ventricles are going to repolarize and get negative, and that's the conclusion of the heartbeat. All right, so very good. The answer would have been C, as I mentioned. Number 31, we're cruising. Edema results when what? Okay, A, capillary filtration exceeds the reabsorption. B, the albumin count increases. C, the osmotic pressure is high. Or D, lymphatic flow increases. So I need to erase this and then we'll draw it out quick. All right, a little crash course capillary action. So with capillaries, we know that they're the smallest blood vessels, and this is where we're actually going to be exchanging nutrients and gases with our cells. So we're gonna have a cell here, and the way the cell gets some of that nutrients out of the plasma and such is going to be forced out of the capillary via something called hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure. This is actually called capillary filtration because we're filtering some stuff essentially out of the capillary, right? But after we feed that, something interesting happens. About 90% of that fluid that left comes back via something called osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure, basically the force of water that's being forced back into the capillary. It's created actually by albumin proteins that draw the water to itself. So osmotic pressure pulls it back in, but interestingly, that's only 90%. Where does the other 10% go? Well, it actually gets rerouted through the lymphatic system, and it's going to drain back eventually to the subclavian vein. So knowing that, let's look at the answers. We've got A, capillary filtration exceeds reabsorption. Let's think about that. Capillary filtration is exceeding how much we can reabsorb. If we are filtering out too much here and we're not reabsorbing, fluid might build up. If fluid builds up, do you know what that's called? That is called edema. So the correct answer would actually be A, but B, albumin count increases. If that were the case, then we'd actually bring in more fluid back to the capillaries. It wouldn't cause edema. C, the osmotic pressure is high. That would bring more fluid back into the capillaries. That's not right. Then lymphatic flow increases. That would actually draw fluid out. So we wouldn't have edema in any of those cases. So the correct answer would be A. Brilliant. Number 32, MAP does not include which of the following? We've got A, systemic vascular resistance, B, heart rate, C, venous return, or D, stroke volume. Well, MAP, mean arterial pressure, is a very simple calculation. It's going to be cardiac output, which we talked about earlier, times something called peripheral resistance, systemic vascular resistance, afterload, basically the same thing. So we know SVR is in there, but cardiac output has two values, as we mentioned, stroke volume and heart rate. So therefore, all three of these values would be involved in measuring your mean arterial pressure. So therefore, the correct answer would be C. Venous return has nothing to do with the pressure average on your arteries. So the correct answer would be C. And now number 33, we're talking about the lymph node, lymphatic system. Lymph is formed when, hey, you know this answer, read them through. Plasma leaks into veins, interstitial fluid enters the lymphatic capillaries, blood enters the lymph nodes, or T cells leave the thymus. The correct answer would be B. The interstitial fluid, the space between the cells and the blood, leaks or enters into the lymphatic capillaries, the tiny little blood vessels dealing with the lymphatic system. And notice that this is actually plasma. This is just fluid that has entered into the lymphatic system, and now we consider that fluid lymph. So the correct answer is B. All right, 34, the largest lymphatic organ. This is kind of a know you or don't. A, spleen, B, thymus, C, tonsils, D, lymph nodes. So the spleen is relatively large, a little more than a walnut size, I believe, in the upper left quadrant of your abdominal cavity. You got the thymus sitting on top of your heart, but it's actually atrophied if you are an adult, so it's pretty tiny. C, tonsils. You got several different tonsils in the back of your throat, but they're not very big. Then the lymph nodes, sometimes you can feel them in your inguinal area, but they're very, very tiny. So the correct answer would be A, the spleen, because it's a relatively large organ. And it kind of acts as almost a lymphatic node for the blood. Helps to recycle some dead blood cells and worn out stuff. and it also helps potentially fight infection. It's got a lot of white blood cells inside of it, so that's all the functions there. And then 35, the thymus is most active during, we've got A, infancy and childhood, B, middle age, C, old age, or D, prenatal development. Well, what do we know about the thymus? I like to think of the thymus as a boot camp for your T cells, okay? Boot camp for T cells. Well, what do our T cells do? This is a type of lymphocyte, a white blood cell, that's going to recognize what is good, so what is a human, versus what is foreign. So it's almost learning friend or foe, similar to what you would do in a boot camp. You would figure out who are the bad guys and hurt them, and then the good guys, don't hurt them, equally as important, right? So when do we want our essentially immune cells to start figuring this stuff out? Probably when we're born and we're starting to get exposed to these bad things, as well as through basically childhood, right? So the most active time the thymus is really working is going to be A, infancy and childhood. Actually, after childhood, the thymus kind of degenerates. We don't use it anymore. So you don't really have a thymus if you're an adult. All right, moving on. Number 36, antibodies are produced by who? A, the macrophages, B, the T helper cells, C, the NK, natural killer cells, or D, the plasma cells. Well, macrophages, those are big eater cells. B, the T helper cells actually don't produce anything except for like interleukins. So those don't necessarily produce the antibodies. Natural killer cells are a part of the innate immune system, have nothing to do with antibodies. So the correct answer is the plasma cells, sometimes called the plasma B cells. And these are a different type of lymphocyte, the B lymphocytes, and they are going to produce those antibodies. So what those look like here are your B cells. They will produce these proteins called antibodies. And if we have some sort of a bacteria that has an antigen on it, so a little flag, that antibody will attack it and trigger that bacterial cell or virus for destruction. So antibodies are very, very important in the adaptive immune system. All right, number 37. The first line of defense, talking about immunity, includes A, antibodies, B, T cells, C, the skin and mucous membranes, or D, complement proteins. Well, of those, you can probably guess which one comes essentially first in protecting you. Well, you can probably guess it's C, skin and mucous membranes, because there's viruses outside of you right now and you want to be protected from them. So you're covered in skin to prevent them from getting into you. Now, the other ones are going to be more internal defenses, like antibodies in the blood and the interstitium. You got T cells flowing through your bloodstream, your lymphatic system. And then complement proteins, there's a cascade in your blood that if they bind to essentially an antibody that's attached to bacteria or something, the complement cascade will cause basically a protein stabbing of that pathogen, which is really important. But those are all internal defenses. The correct answer would be C. Number 38. One of the biggest misconceptions, a fever helps fight infection by A, directly killing microbes, B, increasing blood pH, C, inhibiting microbe reproduction, or D, lowering metabolic rate. Most people typically say A, like it kills off the bacteria, does it not? Well, if you think about it, our body temperature is like 98 degrees Fahrenheit or about 37 degrees Celsius, right? When we get a fever, it usually only goes to about 101 maybe. Maybe we get up to like 30, I don't know Celsius very well, maybe 38 or 39 degrees Celsius. When you're cooking your food to kill the bacteria in your food, do you just cook it up to that temperature? No, we typically have to cook it up to like 165 degrees Fahrenheit or something pretty high for Celsius in order to kill bacteria, right? So we never kill bacteria just by getting a fever. But what we can help prevent is bacterial replication. You see, whenever we warm up the body ever so slightly, some of the proteins that bacteria need to function properly change shape. So if those proteins change shape, it actually slows down how quickly they can reproduce. So it actually helps us fight off the infection a little faster so the bacteria aren't growing as much. So the correct answer would be C, inhibiting microbe reproduction. And that also includes, I believe, viruses as well. Okay, moving on. 39. Which cell is a part of the innate immunity? So we know that innate versus adaptive, anytime we're talking about the adaptive immune system, it's going to deal with the production eventually of antibodies, which are very specific proteins that'll attack a very specific antigen. Whereas the innate immune system is kind of like generalized and widespread, and it kind of happens all over the place. So which one would be part of the innate? We've got B cells. Well, we said the B cells produce antibodies, so that's not right. B is T cells. Well, T cells, we mentioned, help tell the B cells to make antibodies, so that's not right. C is the plasma cells, same exact thing. And then D is natural killer cells. So the correct answer is NK cells, natural killer cells. These guys actually recognize if things are cancerous or infected throughout your body. It doesn't matter which pathogen you got infected with. These guys will notice it if they're, again, infected with something or if they turned into cancer, and they will kill it. So that is why it's kind of part of the innate system. It doesn't matter what pathogen, what cancer, it's going to kill it regardless. It's very generalized. All right, so the correct answer would be D. Number 40, the complement system. We talked about this already. The complement proteins, what does it do? It pokes holes in the cells. What does that mean? B, causes cell lysis. Cell lysis means to break or burst. So those proteins, when they bind to that pathogen via that antibody, they're going to pop that cell open and it will blow up. It will lyse. Okay, just like Squidward when he ate too many Krabby Patties. He lysed. All right, number 41. Antigen presentation to T cells requires what? A, MHC proteins, B, iron, C, hemoglobin, or D, actin polymerization. This kind of takes a little bit of a background, but we know that T helper cells specifically, as well as cytotoxic T cells, they will have either a protein on their membrane called CD4, or, so that's for a T helper cell, I can kind of jot this down, or if you are a cytotoxic T cell, cytotoxic T, you will have typically a CD8 protein on the outside. So this is a little different, CD8. Both of them will bind to a specific antigen complex, and this flag holder, I like to call it, is called the MHC complex. In this case, it'd be MHC1, and in this case, it would actually be MHC2. Okay, MHC2, when these guys bind, it'll trigger basically antibody production, whereas the cytotoxic T cell, if MHC1 is presenting, CD8 comes in, it'll actually kill whatever cell presented that. So this is typically an infected cell of yours or a cancerous cell of yours. And when it expresses the MHC1 with some sort of foreign antigen, it's basically saying, hey, I'm infected or cancerous, I present it, CD8 binds and kills it. But either way, uses those MHC proteins, so the correct answer would be A. Okay, so this is the last one for immune system. Then we're going to move on to the respiratory. So number 42, a secondary immune response is A, due to the memory natural killer cells, and B, slower than the primary response, C, mediated by hormones, or D, initiated by memory B cells. Well, we know that the primary immune response is basically you get sick with something new, and it's going to take a while to respond to it and fight it off. That's primary. But then, let's say you get that same infection a second time, well, then you fight it off within hours and even like maximum a day or two. Okay, it doesn't take as long. Why is that? Well, it's because it's initiated by a memory cell, but not the natural killer cell. You see, when B lymphocytes differentiate, turn into plasma cells, this is only about 75% of the cells that were differentiated. 25% actually turn into what we call memory B cells that remember how to make the antibody for a specific pathogen, but they go and lie dormant until that infection occurs again. So if you get that infection again, these guys wake up like a giant after slumber and begin making the antibodies to fight off that infection that you've seen before. So that would be the correct answer, D. Well done. All right, so now we're into the respiratory system. So the question 43 is the site of gas exchange is the what? A, bronchi, B, alveoli, C, trachea, or D, the pleura. So we know with the respiratory system, we've got that windpipe we call the trachea. So obviously the air is going to be flowing down through the trachea, and then that will branch off into two main bronchi. Okay, so these are the bronchi. So both of these are a part of it. However, the main goal is to get these into smaller and smaller tubes, terminating eventually in very small air sacs that we call alveoli. And that's where the gas exchange from the outside environment is going to mix in with our blood, fascinatingly enough, and we're going to have that gas exchange at that location. So the correct answer would be B, alveoli. Very good. 44. Surfactant prevents what? A, gas exchange, B, coughing, C, alveolar collapse, or D, bronchoconstriction. If you've never heard of surfactant before, what it is essentially is if we were to look inside the alveoli, we will have all of these surfactant molecules, and they'll kind of be pointed in a certain direction like this. And that force that is created by the surfactant molecule actually pulls the alveoli this direction, okay? The way it does that is by reducing surface tension. You can watch it in a video I've made. It's called How Does Surfactant Work? But what it does is it basically keeps the alveoli open, so even when you breathe out and the alveoli start closing, the alveoli will never ever collapse. So the correct answer in this case would be C, alveolar collapse. All right, moving on, number 45. Most oxygen is transported in the blood how? A, dissolved in plasma, B, bound to hemoglobin, C, fixed to albumin, or D, as bicarbonate. So we're talking about oxygen here, and we know we have a lot of cells dedicated to carrying oxygen, and that's going to be our red blood cells. Each red blood cell can literally carry up to millions of oxygen molecules each, which is insane to think about. So therefore, oxygen is going to bind to these red blood cells a lot, and that's where the location of the oxygen will be until the red blood cells drop it off at the tissues. So what are the red blood cells made of though? Hemoglobin. So hemoglobin would be the right answer. That would be B. Number 46, most CO2 is transported as what? A, gas in the plasma, B, bicarbonate, C, that's actually hemoglobin attached to a CO2, and then D, carbonic acid. This is a really good question because it's talking about how it's transported. So this deals with something called the Bohr and the Haldane effect. Let me really briefly overview it. So we have our cells of our body, and we'll also have our red blood cells here, okay? So what's going to happen constantly is you are putting off CO2 with your cells. They're little smokestacks because they're producing ATP, and a byproduct of that is CO2, the gas. The problem with that is that CO2 is a gas, and it could potentially bubble inside of your blood. So you need to turn it into something that can dissolve well. So therefore, CO2 comes into the red blood cell. It'll combine with a very common molecule, water, and it'll form H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. So you might say, hey, it's carbonic acid, right? Well, that carbonic acid then dissociates into hydrogen ions as well as bicarbonate ions. So that's what acids do. They split apart and they release hydrogen ions in the solution. And from there, the bicarbonate is shifted with chlorine. Chlorine comes into the red blood cell and bicarbonate goes into the plasma. So if you think about it, where's the CO2? Where did it go? Well, it got turned into an ionized version in bicarbonate. And the majority, about 80% of the CO2, is carried as bicarbonate. So the correct answer would be B, although I do have to mention that CO2 can actually directly bind to the hemoglobin of the red blood cell as well. And some of the CO2 is kind of trapped in the undissolved version of carbonic acid, so that could be true. And then a little bit can be dissolved in the plasma. So all of those are correct. It's just most of it is going to be that bicarbonate. So answer is B. 47, the respiratory control center is located in the where? A, medulla oblongata, B, pons, C, midbrain, D, cerebellum. This is talking about the brainstem, y'all. So here's your brainstem. You've got three major parts to it. We've got the medulla oblongata, we've got the pons, and then we've got the midbrain up here. Now we know that there are a lot of regions approximately here that are going to deal with our respiratory rate. So this is in the medulla. That being said, there is a pontine respiratory group approximately here that can oversee their firing. So although the main center is in the medulla, there are some in the pons. So the correct answer here would be A, but there are some other locations that can influence respiratory rate. Number 48. Air moves into the lungs when what? A, intrapulmonary pressure rises. B, intrapleural pressure rises. C, atmospheric pressure is lower, or D, intrapulmonary pressure is lower? This is a great question. So what we know is our lungs obviously are kind of butted up against the thoracic cage. And anytime our thoracic cage or our diaphragm below it expand, so the diaphragm contracts downward, we expand our rib cage, the lungs will actually inflate, open up, and change in volume. So I'm going to draw the lungs increasing in volume here. Well, anytime we increase the volume of an enclosed space, we increase the volume, we're actually going to decrease the pressure. So the intrapulmonary pressure, the pressure inside of the lungs, decreases. Well, the air pressure remained at approximately 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level, but now we have opened up a volume, decreased the pressure here, so maybe we've gotten down to like 759 inside the lungs. Now the air is drawn high to low pressure into the lungs because things in nature like to flow from high to low. So the correct answer would be D. Intrapulmonary pressure is lower than the outside. Brilliant. Number 49, hyperventilation causes what? A, respiratory acidosis, B, respiratory alkalosis, C, metabolic acidosis, or D, metabolic alkalosis. Well, we're talking about hyperventilating, breathing a lot. So we know it's dealing with the respiratory system, so it's one of the first two, but the question is acid or alkaline. Well, if we are exhaling a lot, so we're constantly breathing out, breathing out, breathing out, breathing out, what does the majority of our, air go out as? Well, we think of it as CO2, right? We're losing CO2 out of the body. So if we lose CO2, let's think about it. We're taking out some of the CO2. If we take out some of the CO2 out of our body, we get rid of all of the downstream effects. So we no longer, as you noticed, I erased the hydrogen ion, right? So when we lose CO2, we lose acid. And if we lose acid, we become more alkaline. So in this case, this would actually cause respiratory alkalosis due to the loss of CO2. Losing the acid out of our blood makes our blood alkaline. So the correct answer is B. In the flip side, if you were hypoventilating, that would actually cause respiratory acidosis. We're holding on to too much CO2 and make a lot of acid in our blood. Number 50, the volume of air exchanged during quiet breathing is what? So we're just breathing normally. We've got A, the IRV, B, the ERV, the C, tidal volume, or D, residual volume. So we typically in our class teach this graph. So here's the volume of your lungs, and then this is over time when you're just doing a certain breathing exercise. When you're just breathing normally, your volume will shift about like this. And then if you breathe in a lot, volume increase a lot. Breathe all the way out, it'll go way down, and then we'll just go back to normal breathing again. It'll look something like this. Well, we've got several different metrics here. From this top part to this top part is called your inspiratory reserve volume. When you basically go from the top part of your normal breath to the very, very most you can breathe in. Then we also have our expiratory reserve volume, where we go from the lowest part of this part to the very most breath we can breathe out, and that is our expiratory reserve volume. Neither of these deal with normal breathing. This is when we're breathing in a lot and then a lot out. What's our normal breathing? It's this little graph from here to here, and we call this our tidal volume. So our tidal volume is the amount of air that we bring into our lungs during a total normal, calm inspiration and expiration. So the correct answer would be C. Residual volume is actually the remainder left after you breathe out as much as possible. So this is that residual volume. It'll never get to zero because surfactant keeps your alveoli from collapsing completely. So the correct answer is C. Moving on to 51. Which of the following increases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen? It's a great question. A, high CO2, B, low pH, C, low temperature, D, high temperature. I'm going to use this diagram to help us answer that. We know with this process, as we produce CO2, we put it in the red blood cell and we produce those hydrogen ions, right? Well, the hydrogen ions actually go and bind to our protein hemoglobin, which is carrying oxygen at this moment. When hydrogen is present, it's really acidic. What actually happens is hemoglobin lets go of that oxygen. So oxygen can flow to the tissues to feed the tissues, okay? Well, this is also at our body tissues itself. So as we're producing CO2, now that oxygen has left, hemoglobin can actually bind to CO2 now. So what do we have here? We're at our body tissues. We made an acid. We let go of oxygen so that CO2 could bind. Let's think about this. Which increases hemoglobin's affinity. So affinity basically means it wants to grab it, right? High CO2. When we had a lot of CO2 here, it actually forced hemoglobin eventually to kick it off. So that wouldn't be right. B is low pH, so more acidic. Well, we made acid and we kicked off the high oxygen, right? So that wouldn't be correct. C is low temperature. Well, let's think about that one a second. D is high temperature. I told you this is at the body tissues. This is like in deep inside of your body. and that's going to be pretty warm. Where is it relatively low? It's actually in your lungs when it's interacting with the cooler environment outside. So when the cooler environment, the cool air comes into your lungs, it's relatively low in temperature, and that increases the amount of oxygen that will actually bind to the hemoglobin. So if we think about, like, here's the blood vessel, here we're bringing in our oxygen. We want that oxygen to get packed onto our red blood cell here. And so luckily, since it's a relatively low temperature here, that increases the red blood cells, the hemoglobin's affinity to grab that oxygen, so that now that oxygen can be delivered to all the tissues of the body. So the correct answer would actually be low temperature C. That was a tough one. Moving on to 52. This is easy. The Bohr effect describes how what? Well, let me tell you quick. The Bohr effect says, hey, the more acidic, the more hemoglobin lets go of oxygen. That's what the Bohr effect is. The more acidic, the more hemoglobin lets go of oxygen. Which of the following answers that? A, CO2 increases oxygen binding. B, nitrogen binds hemoglobin. C, oxygen increases CO2 binding. Or D, low pH, hydrogen ions, decreases oxygen binding. Oxygen's leaving. So the correct answer would be D. External respiration, number 53, occurs between what? A, the blood in the tissues. B, the lungs and the atmosphere. C, the blood in the alveoli. Or D, the cells and the mitochondria. Respiration just means a gas exchange, essentially, in different locations. When we're talking here, this was the cell, red blood cell, talking basically to this cell, giving it that gas and exchanging the gases. This is considered internal respiration. Where does external respiration occur? Between the lungs and the blood. This is technically outside of your body right here, so that's external respiration. And it's happening at the alveoli to the capillaries. So the correct answer there would be what? C, the blood and the alveoli. All right, number 54, the primary site of nutrient absorption is the A, small intestine, B, stomach, C, large intestine, or D, esophagus. Well, this section is going to make me hungry, but the correct answer obviously is going to be A, small intestine. The small intestine is the longest part of our digestive tract. It's got a lot of curves and microvilli and villi to increase the surface area for absorption, so that would be the right answer. Number 55, the parietal cells. This is kind of a you know it or you don't. What do they secrete? A, mucus, B, pepsinogen, C, mucus again, whoops, and then D, hydrochloric acid. Okay, well, we can kind of cut out mucus, right? Because double is a good test-taking strategy. So it's between pepsinogen and HCl. I always remember with parietal cells affect the pH. So parietal pH. How do they do that? They produce our hydrochloric acid that'll dissolve hydrogen ions, make it acidic, into the stomach to help us basically unravel proteins, protect us from bacteria, etc. So the correct answer would be D. The chief cells actually produce pepsinogen. The way I remember that, for the chief cells, okay, they produce pepsinogen. And if you are a football fan, the Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes. So you can remember Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes. Parietal cells change the pH. All right, moving on. Number 56, bile is produced by, keyword, the what? A, the gallbladder, B, the pancreas, C, the stomach, or D, the liver? Well, we know for A, the gallbladder stores the bile, but it actually can't produce it. The one that produces the bile is actually the liver. Okay, so the correct answer would be D, liver, and it's made of some cholesterol and some salts to help us digest some fats. Number 57, on digestion, which enzyme digests proteins? A, amylase, B, lipase, C, trypsin, or D, maltase? Well, this is when you need to know your prefixes. So anytime you're talking about, what's the first one? Amylase, right? So amylase, I always remember that Amy was a very sweet person in my grade when I was growing up. So remember, Amy means a carbohydrate because carbs are sweet, okay? ACE always means enzyme that breaks apart, so it's a breaking down of carbs. That would not be right. B was the lipase, right? So lipase, you can probably guess, lipid enzyme. We're breaking down fats. No. C, trypsin. This is the hard one because trypsin kind of implies like, hey, that's not an enzyme. But some enzymes end in IN, and this one would be the one digesting proteins, whereas the maltase is actually going to be a maltose enzyme. We're breaking down the disaccharide of maltose. So, correct answer would be C, trypsin. Number 58, the brush border is found in the where? A, stomach, B, jejunum, C, esophagus, or D, the colon. Brush border are enzymes that are located specifically in the small intestine. So the small intestine have these brush border enzymes, and they're going to be the following. They're going to be sucrase, they're going to be maltase, actually, as we talked about, and they're also going to be lactase. These are all the brush border enzymes in the small intestine, and they're going to break down disaccharides to sugar unit molecules so we can basically digest them to absorb these sugars. So the correct answer here would be it's in the small intestine. Which of those is part of the small intestine? The jejunum, because we remember we have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum as a part of the small intestine. Number 59, peristalsis is A, mixing contractions, B, propulsive contractions, C, segmentation, or D, haustral churning. Peristalsis literally means around a structure moving. Okay, so stasis is not moving, stalsis means to move. So peri, moving, it is kind of be propulsive contractions. We're pushing things through the digestive tract, so it would be B. For number 60, the hormone that stimulates gastric acid secretion is A, secretin, B, cholecystokinin or CCK, C, gastrin, or D, leptin. So let's actually go through these. This is going to be important for you to know if you're quizzed on the stomach. So secretin, okay, what that's going to do is increase sodium bicarbonate. I'll write it all out. Increase sodium bicarb at the pancreas. That's actually going to help neutralize the acid that's going into the small intestine. So this is actually released in response to a lot of acid in the small intestine so that we can neutralize it with that bicarb. So that would be secretin. CCK, cholecystokinin. Anytime we're talking about cyst or chole, usually it's referring to cholesterol. Cyst usually refers to the gallbladder. So this actually increases bile release at the gallbladder. And it's in response to very fatty, protein-thick chyme and food that's in the stomach, so we can obviously digest the fats with the bile. Whereas the gastrin, that's basically translated to the stomach hormone protein, and that is going to be the correct answer here. It's going to stimulate that hydrochloric acid secretion of the parietal cells so that we can digest those proteins during just typical digestive processes. So that would be C. Leptin is actually going to be the satiety hormone. It tells us that we are full. So that's helpful so that we don't overeat. So yeah, that's what it is. C would be gastrin. Number 61, the large intestine's main function. So we're through the small intestine, into the large intestine. What is it? A, protein digestion, B, absorbing carbs, C, churning and mixing, or D, water and electrolyte absorption. You can kind of think of this one as kind of a gross example. If you have chronic diarrhea, right? So you're pooping a lot, it's really loose stool, it's really nasty. That's an issue with the large intestine typically, right? The large intestine's getting it out. So what are you concerned about? You're concerned about dehydration and you're concerned about your electrolyte balance. So you could predict D, water and electrolyte absorption is a function of the large intestine so that if it's not functioning properly, you're not getting those water and electrolytes. So the correct answer is D. As well as we also absorb some vitamins here that are actually produced by the microflora, the bacteria in your colon, which is fascinating. 62, pancreatic amylase digests what? Lipids, polysaccharides, proteins, and fiber. This one should be easy. Remember, amylase, carbohydrates. It's going to be the polysaccharides. Fiber is a carbohydrate, interestingly, for D, but it's indigestible. Enzymes for us don't break down fiber, so the correct answer would be A, polysaccharides. Number 63, we're cruising. The hepatic portal vein carries blood from the A, heart to liver, B, liver to intestine, C, the GI tract to the liver, or D, the liver to the heart. What's really interesting about the hepatic portal system, so I'm just going to draw like, here's the stomach, it's going to connect to the small intestine, and then it's going to connect to the large intestine. These are our three locations: stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. What's really fascinating is all of the blood that is going to be basically picking up these nutrients in these three locations in the GI tract is going to immediately go to that organ of the liver, which is fascinating. That is via the hepatic portal system. Okay? It's important to neutralize toxins we may have eaten. It's important to decide what to do with the nutrients that we've just absorbed. But here's the key. It went from the stomach through the intestines, the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, and it's going to drain all that blood to the liver. So the correct answer here would be C, the GI tract to the liver. Number 64, the appendix. This is know it or you don't. What is it attached to? A, the cecum, B, the ileum, C, the jejunum, or D, the transverse colon. The correct answer is A, the cecum. It's the first little pocket of your large intestine. That's actually on the lower right quadrant of your abdominal cavity. And so therefore, that's why if you get lower right quadrant pain, that's your appendix. It's not pretty. It might be bursting. So go to the doctor immediately. So the correct answer is A. Moving on to 65, we're cruising through the digestive system. Now we're talking kind of about nutrition. 65, the glycemic index measures what? A, fiber content, B, rise in blood sugar or glucose after eating a food, C, protein digestion, or D, vitamin absorption. Well, the name glycemic index should kind of tell you what it's doing. Glycemic. I spelled it wrong, glycemic. That's going to refer to carbs, okay? So sugars. Emic usually refers to blood. So it's literally saying the sugar blood index. So it's basically the measure of how fast your blood sugar rises after eating a certain food. So the correct answer would be B. Very good. Number 66. Soluble fiber, A, speeds up gastric emptying, B, forms gels and slows glucose absorption, C, has no physiological role, or D, is a type of starch. So soluble fiber, it's found in like oatmeal and different fibrous foods. But what it does, people usually say, hey, soluble fiber, if you eat more, it lowers your blood sugar, right? Kind of. More accurately, soluble fiber slows how fast glucose gets into your bloodstream because it almost holds on to the glucose inside the GI tract, and then every so often the glucose gets absorbed. But the soluble fiber slows that down, so it keeps your blood sugar relatively lower after eating rather than spiking it immediately. So correct answer would be B. Very good. That's why it's actually good if you're going to have like a candy bar, have like some oatmeal with it or have like some nuts with it because there's some soluble fibers in those things. It'll lower how quickly your blood sugar will rise. Okay. All right. Middle schoolers' favorite number here, 6, 7. I can't believe I just did that. Please make fun of me in the comments for that. Complete proteins contain A, only essential amino acids, B, all the essential amino acids, C, no amino acids, or D, only non-essential amino acids. Well, with complete proteins, it's a complete protein. It's got everything you need, essentially. See what I did there? With the essential amino acids, so complete proteins are going to have all the essential amino acids, okay? I believe there's another question on this, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what those essential amino acids are, but for this case, the correct answer would be B. So for number 68, an essential amino acid is one that what? A, can be synthesized by the body, B, must be obtained through the diet, C, is found only in animal products, or D, is only needed in childhood. Well, essential amino acids, fun fact, is true for C and D. They're in animal products, they're in plant products as well, though, and they're needed throughout childhood, throughout your adulthood, etc. So they're very essential. Why are they essential? Why are they considered essential? Don't you need all the amino acids? Yes, you do. You need all 20 amino acids, but the essential ones you can't synthesize. You cannot synthesize the essential amino acids by yourself. So what do you have to do? B, you have to obtain them through your diet. So remember the essential amino acids, it is essential that you eat them, right? All of them are important, but it's essential that you eat the essential ones. Number 69, fats yield how many kcals per gram? So kilocalories, normal, but kcals are the same thing as calories. And it's going to be 2, 3, 4, or 9. Fats are the highest of them. So proteins and carbs typically are around 4 to 5, but fats are actually going to be 9 calories per gram. That's one reason if you look at like olive oil, man, like 2 tablespoons of olive oil is something like 100 calories. So there's a lot of calories in a very small amount of fats. So the correct answer is D, 9. Number 70, y'all are cruising. I'm so proud of you. Thank you for getting this far. Once again, this is when I take a breath during a final exam. Just look up, look around, take a breather, take a break, because your brain can't handle this so long. So if you're taking a final exam, just take a breather and then reattack it. So we're reattacking at number 70. A food with high GI, glycemic index, and a high carbohydrate content has what? I think you guys could assume this one. A, low glycemic load, B, high glycemic load, C, no effect on glucose, or D, only affects protein digestion. If you think about it, guys, a lot of carbohydrates, high GI, we're going to raise our blood sugar, so therefore there's going to be a high blood sugar load. So the correct answer would be B. All right, number 71, we've actually already answered this. So the primary function of vitamin D is A, RBC production, B, antioxidant production, C, nerve conduction, or D, calcium absorption. We talked about how vitamin D is essential for calcium absorption, and it's very important for bone development as well. So the correct answer would be D. All right, 72, omega-3 and 6 fatty acids are A, saturated, B, trans fats, C, essential fatty acids, or D, conditional amino acids. So we know that these are in things like nuts and maybe some salmon, krill, etc. And we know that the omega fatty acids are actually going to be unsaturated fats. That basically just refers to the structure of the molecule. There's a little bend to it. And we know that these are essential for us, the omega-3s and 6s, because it produces a variety of different precursors for our bodies, whether it's hormones, whether it's fatty acids in our membranes, etc. So the correct answer would be C, they are essential. 73, the liver converts ammonia to what? A, urea, B, glucose, C, acetyl-CoA, or D, bile salts. Well, we know ammonia, I believe it's NH4. I could be wrong on the number there for ammonia, but we know that it's a nitrogenous base, and ammonia is actually relatively acidic, and it's kind of toxic in high amounts, so we have to convert it into something else that is nitrogen containing, and that's going to be our urea. And you can remember that urea is urinated out eventually. So this is actually a byproduct of protein breakdown. So anytime we need to recycle proteins, we produce urea, and then the liver, we produce ammonia, and the liver has to convert it to urea to actually get out of the body successfully. So the correct answer is A. The other ones wouldn't be right because those are non-nitrogenous molecules. They don't have nitrogen. Number 74, the thermic effect of food is highest for what? So the thermic effect of food is basically when we eat food, how much energy is basically used by our bodies and then released as heat as we eat it. So we've got the answers A, carbs, B, proteins, C, lipids, or D, fiber. Now, the correct answer, I'm just going to tell you, is proteins, because we invest a lot of ATP energy in order to basically digest proteins, because typically proteins are very, very long, big molecules. So our bodies have to produce hydrochloric acid via proton pumps that utilize a lot of ATP. We also have to produce a lot of enzymes to break down all those chains of amino acids. And then furthermore, these are relatively thick substances, so moving them through the tract takes some force. So therefore, all in all, we use a lot of energy in order to digest proteins, and therefore we produce a lot of heat from it. That's where we get that thermic effect. So the correct answer is B. 75, the functional unit of the kidney is, we're in the urinary system here, y'all. A, the corpuscle, B, the nephron, C, the tubule, or D, the pyramid. So the pyramid, renal pyramid, is a part of the kidneys, but it's not the functional unit. The tubule is a part of the functional unit, which is going to be that nephron. So we know that with the kidneys, we've got a nephron where we have this little filtration membrane. It's going to wind through something called the proximal convoluted tubule, go down the descending and ascending limbs of Henle, and then we're going to go through the distal convoluted tubule before going to the collecting duct. So this whole thing is going to be the nephron, and that is the functional unit of the kidneys. You've got 1 million per kidney. They're going to filter out your plasma, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along. So the correct answer would be B. 76, filtration occurs at the where? A, the PCT, B, loop of Henle, C, glomerulus, or D, the DCT. So I mentioned these anatomical structures here. This first part, proximal convoluted tubule, is close to the head of the nephron. Got the loop of Henle down here, loop of Henle. Then we have that DCT, the distal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means twisted. And then we have our collecting duct here at the very end. Okay, now we know that when substances are filtered into this area, they're going to go through a specific capillary called the glomerular capillaries. So we've got an afferent arterial here coming in, turns into capillaries, and then we got an efferent arterial. This turns, interestingly enough, into the peritubular capillaries, the capillaries surrounding the tube. Now, that being said, where does the filtration happen? Where do we take something from one location and put it to another location? We know it's here at the glomerulus. This literally translates to ball of yarn, glomerulus, and it means ball of yarn, and it's a ball of capillaries, and some of the plasma from the capillaries is going to leak out, push through this filtration membrane, and get into this tubule. It's now called filtrate, okay? So the correct answer for this case would be C, the glomerulus. This is the location where we're actually filtering things into the tubule. If it stays in the tubule, interestingly enough, it's going to get peed out. If it gets put back into the bloodstream, that's considered reabsorption. Number 77 then, which force promotes this filtration? We already kind of answered this. What force is produced by the capillaries when it's feeding tissues? That's going to be the hydrostatic force, or the hydrostatic pressure. And it's going to be at the glomerular capillary. So the correct answer, quickly, is A, the glomerular, this guy, hydrostatic pressure. Okay, A. Number 79, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which we mentioned at the beginning, increases water absorb. Oh, I skipped one. Shoot, let's go to 78. My bad. 78, aldosterone increases what? We've already talked about this, y'all. We talked about how it's A, sodium reabsorption, so I wanted to skip it anyway. Didn't do that on purpose. So back to 79, water reabsorption. How does the ADH do it? A, at the PCT, B, at the nephron loop, C, at the glomerulus, or D, the collecting duct? I'll tell you that it's the collecting duct, and ADH, as the hormone, will come over here. So ADH traveling through the bloodstream, comes to the collecting duct, and it tells the collecting duct, hey, make more aquaporin proteins, which are these little water hole proteins, so that water can move from the tubule. The tubule is inside where the filtrate is, right? So water can move. If I can open this marker, dang it. This is a tough one. So here's the water. As it moves down to the tubule, it's about to be turned into urine. But since ADH added these aquaporins, these little channel proteins, we can now reabsorb that water. So that is how ADH acts specifically on the collecting duct. Now you may ask, well, why does water want to go there? Well, it's because the deeper you get into the medulla of the kidneys, the saltier it is outside. So therefore, since the capillaries are a little more salty, the water follows that salt into them and gets reabsorbed. So the correct answer would be D, the collecting duct. Number 80, the juxtaglomerular apparatus secretes A, aldosterone, B, renin, C, EPO, D, ADH. Well, we know that there are going to be cells kind of wrapped around juxtaglomerular, right? It's going to be cells around the glomerulus, and they are going to be able to detect, I'll just draw one here, they will detect a low filtration pressure. Low filtration pressure, where? At the glomerulus. So if we detect this low pressure at the glomerulus, that means we're not filtering out things as much. That essentially means we have low blood pressure, could be due to maybe a loss of blood. And so therefore, these guys will respond, and they're going to make a hormone renin. Renin will trigger the RAS system, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Aldosterone will reabsorb salt. Angiotensin vasoconstricts blood vessels, so we're going to narrow up those blood vessels, increase the pressure, therefore restoring the filtration pressure. But again, which cell started it all? It's going to be these juxtaglomerular cells, the cells near the glomerulus that release that renin. So the correct answer would be B. Alrighty. Number 81, the countercurrent multiplier occurs in the, if you were taught this and have to remember it for a test, I apologize to you because I can't even grasp that stuff. But I'll tell you this, the countercurrent multiplier is in the loop of Henle. It's basically the way that we can basically get the urine really, really concentrated while also reabsorbing a lot of the salt and water at the loop of Henle. So the correct answer would be C. Flipping on to 82, y'all. We're on the last 2 pages of my packet. And once again, if you'd like this test in a physical copy, you can go ahead and click that link in the description. All right, 82, y'all. We're almost there. Normal urine should not contain what? A, urea, B, water, C, glucose, or D, urochrome. We've talked about urea already, right? Urine should contain that because we're getting that byproduct out. Obviously, there's water in your urine. Yes, you know that. It's fluid. So B is normal. C, glucose. In the proximal convoluted tubule, this is the exclusive site where we are going to be reabsorbing some glucose because some of the glucose might have leaked out from the blood into the filtrate, and we want to get that glucose back in. So really, all of your glucose should be reabsorbed, and it should not stay in the tube and get urinated out. That would be abnormal because glucose means energy. You don't want to pee out your energy. So the correct answer would be C. If you do notice glucose in your blood, you likely have diabetes. You have really high blood sugar. So that blood sugar just pounds through that filtration membrane. It just keeps going, and you pee it out. So 83, a low GFR. What the heck is that? Well, GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. Okay? Knowing that, glomerular filtration rate right here. There it is. If I can find it right. A low GFR. There we go. A low GFR would what? A, increase urine output, B, increase waste removal, C, reduce filtration, or D, increase sodium loss. You guys can probably guess. If this filtration rate, the pressure, was decreased, now we're not filtering out as much, right? So therefore it would be C, reducing filtration. It wouldn't be increasing urine output. That would actually increase urine output, right? And it wouldn't increase waste removal. It'll actually prevent waste from getting out. So anyway, the correct answer would be C. 84. Most reabsorption occurs in the A, PCT, B, DCT, C, collecting duct, or D, the loop of Henle. If you look at any diagram, you will see the majority of the solutes and fluids that are reabsorbed are in the PCT. This is the all-star of the nephron. It reabsorbs glucose, amino acids, a lot of the water, a lot of the salt, etc. So that's the main area. So the correct answer would be A. The rest of it is primarily just for like water, salts, and some hydrogen ions, bicarbonate, etc. Number 85, a diuretic. I'm going to stop you right there. Anytime you hear the word diurese or diuretic, it means to urinate. To urinate. So, if you guess, a diuretic, what's it going to do? It's going to be increase urine output, okay? Now, this is sometimes a blood pressure medication to decrease your blood volume so that therefore your blood pressure decreases, but typically you need to check your electrolyte levels, make sure they're normal when you're taking a diuretic. Number 86, the main cation of extracellular fluid is what? We are into electrolyte balance, y'all. So we know we've got blood, and we know we've got cells, and we know we've got interstitial fluid. So these are the main three pockets of your body. One's the blood, one's the interstitial fluid, and one's the intracellular fluid. So, thinking about it, which is the main cation, positively charged ion, of the extracellular fluid? So any of the fluid in the blood or the cells, that means outside of the cells, is going to be a lot of sodium. In fact, your sodium in your blood is about 135 to 145 milliequivalents per liter. That's a relatively high number, and it's actually relatively low inside of the cells. So the correct answer would be B. Then you flip it, and it's asking the main intracellular cation, and number 87, is actually going to be potassium. There's a lot of potassium in the cells. It's approximately the same. I'll be honest, I don't know the number, but I think it's somewhere around 120 or 130 milliequivalents per liter. And it's relatively low in the blood. It's only about 3.5 to 5. So that's the main cation inside the cell. And this gradient is maintained by that sodium-potassium pump, kicking the sodium out, pulling the potassium back in. So the correct answer would be B again. Number 88, we're cruising. The buffer system most important in the extracellular fluid, and here is the what? A, the phosphate buffer, B, the protein buffer, C, the bicarbonate buffer, or D, the hemoglobin buffer. Now, all of these are actually buffer systems, but which one's the most important? Well, we know, we were talking about this earlier, all of these cells, I'll just use this one, are making a lot of CO2, and it's throwing that CO2 in the bloodstream, which then produces carbonic acid, which then will dissolve into hydrogen and bicarbonate. This system right here of combining that water and CO2, turning it into carbonic acid and bicarbonate, is the main buffer system that occurs out in the blood plasma. So therefore the correct answer would be C, but I'll tell you, hemoglobin's also a buffer, and the phosphate buffer system actually occurs inside the cell to keep the cell's pH proper. 89. We're almost done. I think we got 11 left or so. Respiratory acidosis is caused by what? A, hyperventilation, or B, hypoventilation. That's it. Those are the only possibilities because we're talking about the respiratory side, right? So what did we talk about earlier? Hypoventilating keeps CO2 in your blood, keeps more hydrogens in your blood, and you become acidic. So the correct answer would be B, hypoventilation. All right, number 90, metabolic acidosis. So now we're out of the respiratory system. Metabolic may result from what? A, severe diarrhea, B, anxiety, C, excess insulin, or D, hyperventilation. Well, we know hyperventilation is respiratory, so we can knock that one out. Severe diarrhea, whenever we're having diarrhea, we're going to be losing a lot of bicarbonate because bicarbonate is really absorbed a lot in the large intestine. Okay, so if we're having a lot of diarrhea, we're losing a lot of that. If we lose a lot of that, that's a type of buffer. So if we lose that, we're actually going to accumulate more hydrogen ions, which will cause acid to build up. So it could be A, severe diarrhea could cause metabolic acidosis. Brilliant. All right, we're almost done with this sort of fluid-based balance, and we're going to go into the reproductive system to finish off. Number 91, ADH primarily affects what? Well, we talked about ADH affecting water reabsorption, right? So the correct answer would be B, water retention. Easy. It's nice when the answer's on the board with me, right? 92. We've also talked about this. Edema is caused by, all right, it's a little different. A, decreased capillary filtration. B, increased plasma proteins. C, increased venous pressure, or D, increased lymph flow. We kind of need to know the flow of blood through this. So remember that we've got these arterioles that will turn into the very, very tiny capillaries here, and that's where all of the filtration will occur. Then immediately afterwards, we're going to be draining into veins, venules first, and then big veins, okay? We know edema can be caused if the capillaries leak out too much fluid and it's accumulating in the space, okay? So let's think about this. If we decrease the amount of stuff getting out of the capillaries, well, that wouldn't make edema, so it couldn't be A. Increased plasma proteins, we talked about the plasma proteins actually draw fluid back in, so that would also not cause edema. Increased venous pressure. What if in the veins, which we know have valves, right, kind of here and here, what if there's a lot of pressure here? A lot of pressure buildup where it's forcing the fluid backwards and backwards because there's so much pressure in the veins. Well, in that case, the fluid could back up and start to leak out and accumulate and cause edema. So therefore, the correct answer would be C, increased venous pressure, and you knew it wouldn't be D, increased lymph flow, because increased lymph flow makes the edema leave, essentially. 93, which hormone increases water intake? This one's really fascinating, right? We mentioned ADH reabsorbs water. Why was it doing that in the first place? Well, probably because you were dehydrated. You had less water in your blood. So what also do you think ADH tells you to do? In addition to its actions reabsorbing water, it's also going to influence you to say, hey, I am thirsty, okay? So if you remember Jesus on the cross said, I thirst. You can guess that he was releasing a lot of ADH at that moment. All right, 94, the site of fertilization is usually the ovary, A, uterus, B, cervix, C, or uterine tube, D. Well, we know we've got the ovaries, we've got the uterine tubes connecting to the uterus. I shouldn't have drawn that part. And then on the opposite side as well. Now, when the ovary releases the egg into the uterine tube, that's typically the site where we want fertilization to occur so that that zygote can continue to develop as it gets implanted eventually into the uterus. So the correct answer would be D, the uterine tube. Number 95, the hormone responsible for ovulation, the release of the egg, is which? A, FSH, B, LH, C, estrogen, or D, progesterone? Well, we know that the trigger for ovulation is going to be LH, and that happens typically around day 14 of a typical 28-day cycle. So I always draw kind of, if you've got the timeline, let's say we've got a 28-day menstrual cycle starting at day 0, which is when your period starts. It's always going to be 14 days prior, right, to the start of menstruation. Okay, so for this example, ovulation would occur at day 14, and that's when that LH is going to spike and cause ovulation. But let's say your cycle is typically, I don't know, 35 days. Well, we subtract 14 from it, then you're going to ovulate more on day 21. So that's really helpful for natural family planning, knowing that you ovulate typically about 2 weeks prior to the start of your menstrual cycle. Okay, so the correct answer would be B. If you want to learn more about menstrual cycle hormones, you can watch that video on my channel. It's called Menstrual Cycle Hormones and Events. All right, number 96, sperm mature and are stored in the where? We've got A, the testes, B, the ductus deferens, C, the epididymis, or D, the prostate. Well, we know that sperm are produced in the testes. So obviously we have testes here, okay? Sperm are going to be produced in the seminiferous tubules, but then they actually travel into a new structure, and that is going to be called, I guess they travel this way, I should draw it that way, and this is going to be called the epididymis. Epididymis. Can never spell this one. That way? Is it the Y first or the I? It is the I first, darn it. So in the epididymis, this is where we're actually going to mature the sperm before they travel through eventually the vas deferens, which would be the long tube that'll eventually carry it out the ejaculatory duct, urethra, and out. Okay, so the correct answer would be C. Number 97, the corpus luteum secretes what? We've got A, FSH, B, LH, C, estrogen and progesterone, and then D, testosterone. Well, there's several things you need to learn about here, but we know in the second part of the menstrual cycle, this is called the luteal phase, and that's when the corpus luteum inside the ovaries is very, very big. And that guy is going to be cranking out 2 main hormones that will be building up. One will be progesterone. I'll just put progesterone. And then the other one will be estrogen, okay? So estrogen and progesterone are both produced by the corpus luteum. I'll draw that here again. So this is estrogen. And both of them are going to help build up the endometrial lining to hopefully cause implantation of that embryo. Okay, so the correct answer would be C. 98, the acrosomal cap of sperm contains A, DNA, B, mitochondria, C, enzymes for penetrating the egg, or D, the nutrients. If we look at a sperm cell, we've got the mid piece with mitochondria, the flagella down here, then we've got the neck and the acrosome. Now the acrosome is this whole head that does contain the haploid nucleus, the half the number of chromosomes that will add to the egg, but at the very tip of the acrosome, the cap, it'll have digestive enzymes, because these are going to have to penetrate through that oocyte, well, specifically through certain cells outside of the oocyte, so that it can get into it and give it that nucleus. So the correct answer would be C. And then number 99, the endometrium, the inner lining, right, of the uterus thickens during the what? I said it's during the luteal phase, because these 2 hormones really build up that endometrium lining, preparing the embryo for implantation. Number 100, y'all did it. Human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, is produced by the who? A, ovary, B, placenta, C, uterine tube, or D, anterior pituitary. A couple things with HCG. HCG is produced by a developing placenta. So the placenta will produce HCG, and that actually keeps, interestingly enough, that corpus luteum intact, so that we can keep that endometrial lining building up throughout the pregnancy. But sadly and annoyingly, this is also what causes morning sickness. So HCG spikes about, give or take, 8 to 12 weeks into the pregnancy, and you don't feel very good typically. So best of luck on your A&P2 final. Let me pray for you real quick, and we'll be out of here. Lord, we thank you for this time. Thank you for the opportunity to learn about this incredible body that you have designed so perfectly. Lord, bless whoever's watching this. Bless them in their final exam, in their future as a healthcare provider. Lord, help them to shine your light through their lives so we can give glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen.